In this third and final part of the series of how to make a low-budget performance-style music video, I'm going to jump into the color grade. I'm also going to touch on deliverables and marketing materials. So let's jump over into Resolve. Let me just start by saying that the colors in this video probably aren't going to be perfect because I don't think that my screen capture software can do 422 10-bit, but the same principles will still apply. It's also important to note that I won't be able to play anything back in real time because this is quite effects heavy, and with the drain on system resources from OBS, it's not going to play back smoothly. So we want to start by choosing a hero frame, one that kind of represents everything in this video. If you have multiple different scenes, you're still going to need hero frames, you're just going to need one per scene. Once you've graded your hero frame, you can just copy and paste that node tree across to all of your different shots and then adjust things as needed. So let's jump over into the node tree here and see what's going on. I'll just start by turning everything off. So the first node I've got here is noise reduction. This is usually the one that I do last, and I'll leave it turned off for now. The first and most important node is the primary color correction. So if we turn that on, you can see that that already makes a pretty drastic difference. What we're doing with this is balancing all of our exposures and colors. You can see here that none of the blacks are being crushed and none of the whites are peaking. Every time you copy and paste this grade over to another shot, you're going to have to turn all of the nodes off and then do your primary color correction from scratch each time. A quick and easy way to get the whites where you need them is to go over here into your primaries wheel, and there's an eyedropper tool. If you take that eyedropper tool and take a sample from somewhere that you know for a fact ought to be white, that's going to fix your white balance issues if you have any. After that, you're just going to move your shadows, midtones, and highlights until your scopes are where you need them to be. This next portion here is a film emulation node tree. I'm not going to go into too much detail on how that works. In its place, you could alternatively use a single node with a film emulation LUT on it, or potentially skip it altogether. I just happen to like the way that film handles contrast curves and highlights. The next layer is a general adjustment layer. Basically what this is doing is it's a look adjust. So this primary node here was balancing and fixing any errors. This here was adding a look, and then this here is adjusting the overall look. It's important to note that color correction and color grading are two very different things. So this part here is color correction, and then all of the rest of this is color grading, and then this stuff over here is effects. So I'm not in love with the way that these skin tones are looking, so next I'll do a skin ISO, and that just moves the skin tones to where I want them to be. To isolate the skin, I've just made a bit of a garbage matte using a qualifier. And because this particular video is almost monochromatic apart from the skin, it was easy enough to just grab it without getting into too much detail. If there was a lot more going on in the background, I probably would put some garbage mats around the skin areas and pull a much cleaner qualifier, but there was really no need to for this video. If we jump over into full screen mode, you can see how much of a difference that makes. So before, the skin tones were incredibly magenta, and with this adjustment, they just give it a little bit of warmth and life. After that, we have another global adjustment layer. This is just adding a little bit of mid-tone detail, playing with the contrast a tiny bit. It's important to know that if you pull qualifiers, you have to work forward. You can't go back and adjust this adjustment layer here too much anymore, because it's going to affect the way that your HSL qualifier is working here. So basically, if you want to do any global adjustments after you've pulled the skin qualifier, it's generally best to do them afterwards. So if we just take a look at how much of a difference that the actual color work has made so far. This is straight out of the camera with a conversion LUT to take it from log to Rec 709. And then this is the initial grade, which has got a lot more punch and life to it. If we then move over here into this VFX area, because this is a music video, I want to give it kind of an interesting look, so I wanted to emulate sort of vintage lenses. This was shot on very clean modern lenses, and they don't have a huge amount of character. So this node tree starts with a lens distortion, which just squeezes the edges out a tiny bit. The reason why I've put this in is because the next node is a vignetted blur around the edges, which would emulate edge softness in the image. Now, the lens distortion is what would create the softness in the edges. So these two here are essentially a single unit. After that, I added some lens reflections. Now, this just gives a little bit of blooming across the frame and milks out the blacks relative to where the highlights are. This is basically just to emulate vintage lens coatings or lack thereof. It's really important to note that you have to be subtle with this stuff or it will look terrible. I was playing around with anamorphic lens flare, but I decided that it looked way too cheesy, and if I'm going to use that effect, I will most certainly do it on set. After that, we add a simple vignette. If we take a look here at the mask, you can see that this particular vignette is centered. But sometimes what I'll do is if the action is happening more on one side or more the top of frame or more the lower frame, I'll actually adjust my vignette across to match it sometimes. And finally, we have grain. So because you don't want to be stacking grain on top of noise, we're going to go back to this noise reduction node and turn that on. And then we're going to drop the grain on top of that. So let's turn all of that off for a second. Jump into full screen mode. So again, this is straight out of the camera with a simple log to Rec 709 correction LUT chucked on it. And this is the final look. You can see that the grain and the lens artifacts that I've added in are pretty subtle, and that's how I would like them to be. I think as soon as you add in effects that become immediately obvious that you've added effects in, it loses all of its magic and it just sort of becomes a bit, pastiche and cheesy. And that's pretty much it. Now you just go over to all of your other shots, and every time you open a shot, you copy and paste your node tree across, which I generally do by right-clicking in this window, grabbing still, and then applying the grade to the new shot that I move over to. So once you copy and paste that all across, you're going to go in, you're going to disable all of your nodes, and then you're going to go into this primary corrector node, and you're just going to do your primary corrections, make sure that it's sitting on the node tree where you want it to be, none of the blacks are crushing, the highlights are where you want them to be. Especially in a video like this where we have pretty consistent blacks and whites, you want to try and keep your blacks and your whites consistent from shot to shot. And that way when you add the rest of your node tree, everything's going to match. So once the primary correction's done, we can turn all of the other nodes back on, and then if any adjustments need to be done, for example, if we wanted to move our vignette a little bit, or if our lens blur was a little bit too strong because this is a wide shot, and obviously we can have a little bit more lens blur in the corners for close-ups than we can for wides. This is the time where you fix it. So you would just go into your lens settings here and you change your blur size and so on. I don't recommend for the blur to touch the blend mode at all, because although it can make sense in your head to change the opacity of the effect, because this is specifically a lens blur that's emulating the way that lenses work, changing the opacity or global blend is not going to give you the effect you want. You have to change the actual blur size itself, because otherwise it ends up stacking the blur on top of the original image rather than replacing the original image with the blur. And that's pretty much it for the grade. After that, you want to put in some decent looking titles. I think some quality looking titles is often what can be the difference between something looking quite amateurish and something looking just that little bit more pro. So if we look at the temporary placeholder titles and then look at the finished titles, it's really night and day difference. So during the edit and the grade, I generally keep my timeline in 1080p. My HP Dreamcolor monitor is only 1080p anyway, and I'm outputting to that for color checking. But for deliverables, you just want to make sure to go back and put your timelines onto 4K. So for my primary master, I go and export a ProRes master. If you're on a PC, this would be a DNx HD master. And then I just make sure that the frame rate's correct, the resolution's correct. So this is a 2:1 aspect ratio as opposed to a 16:9 aspect ratio. So you want to make sure that the custom resolution is set for that. And then I generally just output as a ProRes 422 HQ. I find that that's really good enough quality for archival for pretty much any smaller project. It also keeps the file sizes somewhat manageable. And then we render the video out. Finally, we'll have a quick look at marketing materials. At a bare minimum, I think it's pretty important to pull some marketing stills. Although you could let the client pull the stills themselves, I think by pulling them yourself, you have much more control over how your work is being represented. And especially if it's a portfolio piece, I think that's quite important. The difference between frame A and frame B can often make it look like your shot was in focus or not because of the motion blur, and it's really important to choose just the right frames. Especially if the client's not expecting stills, they'll also be super happy to see these at this point. Another thing you can do is put a poster together. You can find a bunch of templates online that make it super easy to put one together quickly, but it just gives them something for Instagram stories and Facebook and so on and so forth, just to build a little bit of pre-release hype, and you can chuck a release date on there too. Just like with the credits, this is a great time to thank the people that donated their time for the video like David did. And that's pretty much it. You got a finished video. I think at this point it's important to note that it's only finished once the client signs it off, so you want to make sure that you organize some sort of screening. If you're working remotely and you can't have the band over for a screening, I think something like Vimeo Plus with a password protected link is a good way to go. Alternatively, you could use something like Frame.io. I personally don't have either one of those accounts that I can do 4K password protected screenings in, so what I did is I uploaded it as a private video to YouTube and then added the band's YouTube email address with it so they could view it remotely while still keeping the video private. So again, this music video was super basic. We had a very tiny budget, but I still wanted to get a good, strong portfolio piece, and I think for the time and resources that we had, I'm pretty happy with how it turned out. So I hope you found this 3-part series helpful. Feel free to leave any questions in the comments and I'll try to answer them as soon as I can. So thanks for watching, and I hope to see you again next time.